Episode 3 Hawkeye. The London and North Eastern Railway was one of the so-called Big Four companies, formed during the 1923 Grouping Act in Britain. In this form, with engines from the North Eastern region and Great Northern Railways, it lasted a mere 25 years, but left an everlasting impression of luxury, prestige and speed. 40 years after the end of British mainline steam, these are the stories they tell. The London and North Eastern and Great Western Railways have always been great competitors, dating back to a time when their railways were famed for their luxury and legendary for their speed. The 1928 exchange trials had seen a Great Western triumph, but arguably this spurred the LNER into creating a certain class of high-speed steam locomotive, the Gresley A4 Pacific. The yard's resident A4 was Sir Ralph. Sir Ralph was not the original engine, rather an engine named in honour of another engine, a curious arrangement that none of the other engines were aware of. Sir Ralph had recently run hot at speed and failed at a station in the central region. After Sir Ralph had been towed from Market Harbour to Doncaster Works, I found myself with an engine problem. While I had of course procured Herbert for the yard, and I had Alan and Stephen of course, there was too much work between the engines of the yard for them to cope. Therefore, I made the necessary arrangements for another engine to work at the yard, temporarily. The only engine available came from the Western region, and so I decided to give the duties of Sir Ralph to Herbert, Herbert's to Stephen, and the visiting engine would do Stephen's shunting for him in turn. It was perhaps ironic that I seemed to lose a Gresley streak and gain some Western muscle. The engine arrived 2 hours earlier than expected, and was already shunting the trucks when I went to leave that evening. "Good evening," he said, bustling up to me. I was intrigued. This was probably the first time since Stephen had arrived on the yard all those years ago that an engine had come to say good evening to me personally. "Good evening," I replied. "What is your name?" "Hawksworth, sir." "After my designer," he replied. "But everyone just calls me Hawk, sir. Shorter that way, sir." "Why, we all have short names, sir, back home, sir. My friend Montague, for instance." "That'll do," I laughed. "Hawk it is, then. Carry on, Hawk. You're doing a fine job with those trucks." "Thank you, sir." "Right away, sir," the engine said, and puffed away. I was impressed, but Alan less so. "I couldn't find my goods train this morning," he complained to Herbert. "You always put it near the coal line. The Western engine put it near the goods shed." "Naturally," Stephen said, "as I hadn't loaded your train yet." "Oh," Alan said. "Well, fair enough. Still, he doesn't talk much, does he?" "Not all engines are chatterboxes like us," said Stephen. "Some engines work better if they concentrate on the job at hand, and besides, he's busy. I'm sure he'll talk to you later on when he takes a break." Alan remained dubious. That evening, Hawk joined the other engines in the yard. "So I said to my driver, there's no way Newcastle will win the cup this year," Alan laughed. "It'll be City's year, I know it will. Unless, of course, my friend Sunderland has anything to do with it," Stephen said, and Herbert interjected. I took a football special home once. I think Norwich took it to London, and I took it back." Hawk was puzzled. "Is it football or engines?" he asked. Alan smiled. "Oh, both. One of the engine classes we work with sometimes were named after famous football teams." "Ah," said Hawk, "like Swindon." Everyone, even Stephen, burst out laughing. Hawk looked rather hurt. Alan stopped laughing and explained. "We're not trying to insult you," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I'm sure Swindon are a great team, but they're not really in the running for the cup." "And why not?" Hawk asked. "Everyone has a shot at it." Stephen smiled. "Well said. That's the spirit." Alan snorted, and Hawk gave him a sidelong glance. "You know, we have a saying at Paddington," Hawk said. "There's the wrong way to go about things, and the Great Western way. I'm Great Western and—" "No, you're not," Alan laughed. "No more than we are LNER." He looked to Stephen for support, but Stephen was looking thoughtful. "Well, we are all British Railways," he said at last, and Alan smirked. "However," Alan stopped smirking, "we are what we think we are." Alan was taken aback. "It says on your tanks, and your tender, property of British Railways, doesn't it?" "Well, yes," Stephen said, "but I'm not talking in a tangible sense. I am an XLNER engine, and I look to uphold the values it stood for, much like Hawke here. Just because something has gone physically, it doesn't mean it has disappeared entirely." Alan shrugged off some steam. "Fair enough, but I was talking about football," he said, and Stephen laughed. Hawke kept quiet, and listened to the engines reminisce about matches they'd heard, or even, in Stephen's rare case, seen. He went to sleep, thinking about Swindon Town, and how one day he'd like to see them play.